Good morning. I'd like to start by thanking Minister Hidaji for hosting these meetings, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Before taking your questions, I'd like to step back and recognize President Biden for his leadership. Over the past 3.5 years, he's driven a remarkable economic recovery and strong economic growth at home, and restored America's standing in the world, enabling progress on many of the priorities I'll be focused on in Brazil this week. I'm deeply proud to serve the American people with him and Vice President Harris, and I look forward to continuing to advance U.S. leadership around the globe and deliver results for American families and businesses at home. Let me now discuss the global economic outlook, the Biden-Harris administration's approach to bolstering the global economy, and furthering U.S. interests and our priorities while in Brazil. Over the past 4 years, we've faced a global pandemic, the effects of Russia's war against Ukraine, and other challenges. And even 2 years ago, many predicted a dismal outlook for the global economy, but they were mistaken. Today, the global economy remains resilient, driven in large part by the United States' remarkable economic performance. Instead of faltering, U.S. GDP grew by a robust 3.1% during 2023, and new data from just this morning shows growth of 2.8% in the second quarter of this year, affirming the path we're on to steady growth and declining inflation. The IMF now expects the U.S. economy to be more than 10% larger by the end of 2024 than it forecasted in October 2019 before the onset of the pandemic. In fact, the United States was one of the few major economies with a cumulative contribution to global growth over the past 5 years that exceeded pre-pandemic expectations. This morning's report and the broader strength we have seen in the U.S. economy in recent years didn't happen by accident. It reflects the Biden-Harris administration's economic plan. 15.7 million jobs have been created since President Biden took office. The unemployment rate remains historically low, and the prime-age labor force participation rate is higher than it has been since 2002. Inflation is down significantly from its peak, trending towards the Federal Reserve's target. Our administration recognizes that prices are still too high for many Americans, so we've advanced an agenda focused on addressing long-standing cost pressures for families in areas from housing to health care to energy. We're also seeing signs of dynamism across the U.S. economy. There have been record numbers of new business applications, showcasing the optimism felt by many American entrepreneurs. Growth in business investment from 2022 to 2024 significantly outperformed what's typical in the years following a recession. And we've seen an historic boom in private sector investment in key industries such as semiconductors, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing. While the Biden-Harris administration's economic plan continues to deliver results at home, we know that there remain risks to the global economic outlook and vulnerabilities in some countries. And because we see that a prosperous and stable global economy benefits not only the world, but also the American people, we firmly believe that America must play a leading role, including to bolster resilient supply chains and to address global challenges. If we step back to reflect on the past few years since our administration took office, I believe we have seen our commitment to strengthening ties with our longstanding allies and with partners around the world and to multilateralism pay off, and we will continue to build on its successes to drive further progress. Following my and Minister Sri Mulyani's call to action, Finance and Health Ministries came together in record time to launch the Pandemic Fund, raising nearly $2 billion for critical global investments in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response to help mitigate the enormous human and economic costs from potential future pandemics like COVID-19. We're now calling for an additional at least $2 billion to double the Pandemic Fund's resources. And I was pleased to announce yesterday that the United States intends to pledge up to $667 million, or 1/3 of the $2 billion goal, to support the Pandemic Fund through 2026, with $250 million contributed this year. We worked with the G20 to rally the global community to address food insecurity, and have seen the international financial institutions significantly step up, increasing financing for food and agriculture by around 60% over the past 2 years to $15 billion annually. We now continue to press the G20 to do more to strengthen the international food architecture. We've made progress on debt relief through the common framework, but urge faster progress for debt restructuring and more support to countries struggling with debt service costs. And we've worked, including through the G20, to evolve the multilateral development bank's mission, incentives, operational models, and financial capacity, leading to enabling over $200 billion in additional lending capacity over the next decade, innovating to offer new financial instruments, and delivering historic levels of climate finance. We now continue to advance the MDB evolution agenda and call on the G20 to deliver a robust and impactful IDA policy and financial package. The United States will continue to demonstrate our commitment to multilateralism while here in Brazil this week, including through a focus on climate. Our administration has made addressing climate change a top priority, and Treasury has played a key role, including through my work with Minister Haddadi and other counterparts, through the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group that the United States co-chairs through China, and through the multilateral climate funds and MDBs. Supported by Brazil's G20 leadership, we're also prioritizing work to reform the climate finance architecture to make accessing finance from the multilateral climate funds easier for countries, to better mobilize the private sector, and to support scaling approaches that work. The work of the independent high-level expert group is ongoing, and I look forward to its recommendations. We're also focused on continued efforts to position the MDBs to better address climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and to pursue broader work on the environment, including on nature and biodiversity. This work is critical to supporting countries in achieving their development goals, and we've made significant progress. Developed countries mobilized a record nearly $116 billion to support developing countries in addressing climate change in 2022, 40% of which was through the MDBs. I will further advance our work in climate this week including by meeting with my counterparts from the countries of the Amazon basin and private sector representatives. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the United States is also playing a key role working with our partners to address geopolitical challenges. As part of a strong global coalition, the United States has taken unprecedented action against Russia's brutal and unjust war on Ukraine. And Treasury remains committed to using all the tools at our disposal to support Ukraine and degrade Russia's ability to sustain this war. We continue cracking down on Russian sanctions evasion and have strengthened and expanded our ability to target foreign financial institutions and anyone else around the world supporting Russia's war machine. As the G7 leaders agreed in Apulia, we are also advancing work to make approximately $50 billion in additional funding to Ukraine by the end of this year. We continue to take action in response to ongoing conflict in the Middle East as well. Treasury remains focused on countering the Iranian regime's financing of terrorist actors, including by taking joint sanctions actions with our G7 partners, ensuring humanitarian aid can get to Palestinians in Gaza, and stabilizing the West Bank economy. I'm glad that Israel has allowed its banks to continue cooperating with Palestinian banks, but I remain convinced that a one-year extension of the waiver to facilitate this cooperation is needed. And our response to geopolitical risks extends from responding to conflict to making sure that people and economies around the world can thrive. The United States has pursued strong collaboration with emerging markets and developing countries and continues to work toward a healthy economic relationship with China in which American firms and workers can compete on a level playing field. This means that I will keep pressing China to address its macroeconomic model, which is channeling too much savings and too many subsidies into manufacturing, contributing to industrial overcapacity. This poses a threat to the viability of firms and workers around the world, and I know my concerns are shared by many at these meetings. I look forward to moving our collective work forward this week, and I'll now take your questions.
Hi, bom dia, Secretary. Bom dia. Hi. There's a lot of questions here, given President Biden's decision to step aside and not seek re-election, about what Kamala Harris's economic program might be, about her approach to international economics that are important to this group. You mentioned them basically in the same breath in your remarks. What's your message to the delegates here? Are you telling them that essentially a President Harris would have the same approach as a President Biden? Is there any daylight between the two on these policies?
Well, thank you for that question. And let me just first offer a few reflections on President Biden's comments last night. I thought that the president displayed grace, patriotism, and wisdom in those comments, and really these are the traits that Americans admire in him. He has a deep respect and love for the American people, for our democracy, and I thought that came through last night. And certainly Vice President Harris shares those same deep fundamentals. I've been deeply proud to work for this president and for the vice president, and I'm committed to continuing that work to make progress on behalf of the American people. And I guess what I can say broadly is that both President Biden and Vice President Harris, for the last 3.5 years, have been working tirelessly on behalf of the American people. And the results, I think, speak for themselves. I mentioned them in my remarks: over 15 million new jobs, an historically strong labor market, key investments in critical sectors of the economy that will fuel our economic growth. And Vice President Harris clearly, deeply understands what's needed to make sure that families in America can thrive, can get ahead. I've had the privilege of working with her on initiatives ranging from direct capital to small businesses, particularly minority-owned businesses, on efforts to make childcare affordable, and on analysis pertaining to the role of unions in our economy. And I would say that Vice President Harris is somebody who deeply understands and has contributed to the policies that have produced these important results. She obviously supports middle-class families. She knows that they are the key to America's economic strength. She's been focused on creating good jobs, lowering costs for Americans in crucial areas like childcare and health care, training workers in industries of the future. It's been my privilege and pleasure to collaborate with her, and more broadly on issues confronting America in the world. She deeply understands what's necessary to and why it's important to restore U.S. leadership on the global stage, and she's been a critical part of that effort. So I feel that the core values that have been reflected in the policies of this administration are ones that Vice President Harris deeply embraces.
Chris Condon, Bloomberg News. Good morning, Secretary Yellen. No matter what happens in November, there will be a new U.S. president, a new administration come January. And it's possible that so much of what you have worked for over the last 3.5 years could be abandoned or even actively reversed. Domestically, we're talking about the energy incentives, for example, under the IRA, the rebuilding of the IRS. And then internationally, you've led efforts on global tax reform, climate finance, MDB reform. You've deeply engaged with Chinese leaders at the highest levels. You've led the effort to support Ukraine and isolate Russia. So my question is, what would the consequences be for the U.S. and indeed for the entire world if the next U.S. administration were to turn its back on all of that? Thank you.
So I'm covered by the Hatch Act and don't want to get into electoral politics. But what I certainly can say is that all of the initiatives that you mentioned are, I believe, important to the success of the global economy and to America's strength and position within it. These are all initiatives that advance the well-being of the American people. And in many cases, and I would say a good example of that would be our support for Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. These are policies that have had strong bipartisan support. Most Americans of both parties recognize that allowing Russia to trample the independence and sovereignty of a country that has done nothing to provoke an attack is something that threatens not only Ukraine, but threatens Europe and our own security. And it is not only in Ukraine's interest, but in the global interest, in all of our interests, to stop this aggression and to do so in a way that involves working closely with our allies. You mentioned the international tax negotiations. We have worked very hard on Pillar 2 and Pillar 1, and I believe the results are broadly seen globally as in the interest of all countries. In the case of Pillar 2, for example, what we've seen over decades is a race to the bottom in which countries compete with one another to attract multinational corporations to see who can offer the lowest tax rate. And this is a self-defeating process that ultimately only enriches corporations at the expense of working people in the United States and around the globe. We've been in close touch with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and I believe there's every reason for them, regardless of who occupies the White House, to ratify that agreement. And we're working tirelessly to try to successfully conclude Pillar 1 negotiations. The last thing American companies need is a proliferation of discriminatory digital services taxes that they will confront in the absence of global cooperation. So global cooperation is something that is deeply in the interest of Americans, and many of the programs that you mentioned, both foreign and domestic, have broad bipartisan support, so I hope they will continue.
Thank you for doing this. I'm Kosuke Takami with Nikkei. My question is about the G7's argument on Russian frozen asset. I'm just wondering, is there any argument that the strengthening sanction on Russian asset put any pressure for Russia toward peace treaty? How can you be sure that it's not escalating the situation? Thank you.
You're referring to sanctions and not the Russian sovereign assets?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, working with our partners, including Japan, since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have really had two objectives of preventing Russia from being able to acquire the military equipment that it needs to prosecute the war in Ukraine, and also trying to constrain and deprive Russia of the revenues that it needs to strengthen its economy and buy that equipment. We've worked tirelessly, jointly with our allies to put in place an evolving and ever-tightening regime of sanctions, the price cap on Russian oil, which initially was very successful, as is true with all sanctions programs. As sanctions begin to bind, Russia looks for ways to skirt those sanctions and to accomplish its goals in other ways. And so our approach constantly needs to be reinforced, strengthened, taken in new directions. We've done that with the price cap as they work to build their own fleet and make themselves independent of Western services, shipping, insurance, and other things. We've strengthened our enforcement of sanctions, the attestation requirements, and we've sanctioned vessels that are involved in carrying Russian oil below the price cap, and we have sanctioned Savcom float vessels and continue to evolve this. So I believe we have constrained Russian revenues. And on sanctions more broadly, our approach continues to evolve, and we see that Russia, of course, has succeeded to a distressing extent in acquiring the military, acquiring the dual-use goods like semiconductors it needs to build up its military establishment. And as we see that, we continue to take further actions to try to interfere with their ability to acquire these goods. Most recently, we've put in place a strengthened regime of potential sanctions on any foreign financial institution that processes payments involving any sanctioned Russian entity, and that includes all the major Russian banks. And we can see from Russia's behavior and the comments that their senior officials have made that this is impairing their ability to acquire the goods that they need. But we know that they will look for workarounds, and we're pleased with the sanctions actions that the UK, that the Europeans have taken working with us. So I think we've been as effective as we can be under these circumstances.
Thank you for taking my question. Yusuke Takebe from Kyodo News. My question is, Mr. Trump said that the strong dollar weak yen is a tremendous burden in the Bloomberg News interview. So do you see any burdens or challenges for U.S. firms in terms of the export competition?
In terms of what?
In terms of export competition for export companies?
Do I see what in terms of it? You said about the strong
I'm sorry, I will say again. So, do you see any burdens or challenges for U.S. firms in terms of export competition?
Export competition. So, you know, the view that our administration has about the dollar is that we believe in a market-determined exchange rate, that especially large economies should allow their exchange rate to be determined by international markets. And over time, I think fundamentals are reflected, fundamental economic conditions are reflected in the value of currencies. The G7 has committed that participants there will have market-determined exchange rates, intervening only rarely and in situations where there's judged to be undue volatility and after consultation with partners. So, you know, at the moment or over the last several years, the United States has had tight monetary policy. Interest rates in the United States have been higher than in many parts of the world. That's induced capital inflows that have strengthened the dollar. That's really something to be expected in a situation where you have a strong economy and a central bank that's working to contain inflation. And, you know, we believe that that's how the system should work.
Hi, Ilona Hughes from Associated Press. I was wondering if you could clarify the US's position regarding Brazil's proposition of a 2% tax on global billionaires.
So the United States is strongly supportive of progressive taxation and making sure that very wealthy, high-income individuals pay their fair share. In the United States, with President Biden has proposed a large number of policies that would accomplish that, including a billionaire's tax. And we think that this is a very worthwhile initiative, that it makes sense for most countries to take this approach of progressive taxation. But we have very different, and we're happy to work with Brazil on that and promulgating these ideas in the G20. But tax policy is very difficult to coordinate globally, and we don't see a need or really think it's desirable to try to negotiate a global agreement on that. We think that all countries should make sure that their taxation systems are fair and progressive.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. Álvaro Campos from Brazilian newspaper. I was wondering if you can comment a little bit about this new initiative the G20 countries launched yesterday to strengthen food security, and this new alliance to fight against poverty and food security, and also the climate initiatives, if there's something more U.S. could do regarding this relationship with Brazil in this subject.
Well, we were very pleased to participate in the initiative on poverty and hunger that Brazil, his President Lula, has proposed, and I was pleased to take part in that conference yesterday. As I mentioned in my remarks, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine that led to a spike in food prices that has had a devastating impact on countries that have already suffer from food insecurity and have been badly affected by climate change that has had an adverse impact on agriculture, that it was important to take immediate and decisive steps to promote greater access to food and to support initiatives that would strengthen agricultural practices, productivity, and make agriculture more resilient. And so we have, the United States has given a substantial amount of money, has worked with the MDBs to increase their contributions to food security. We sponsored, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an action plan for all the international financial institutions to take action to promote, to address food insecurity. We've been supportive of IFAD and GAFSP, the global multilateral institutions that are addressing agriculture and resilience. So we're very supportive of this effort and hope that we're going to be able to contribute to it through our work.